system, and the people that are reliant upon that are going to actually be able to do that sort of very rapid adoption. And I think that is the key of asking this question of whether there is going to be this large-scale displacement of the wealth in the middle class. And the other thing that I think is very clear, and first of all, obviously that ties back to the educational mission of this university, is to make sure that we're preparing as many people as we can for those changes. But the second one that I was going to bring up is to make sure, as we think about patents and we think about locking up intellectual property, if there is not a change in the patent laws, I think there is this chance to be locking up vast amounts of wealth that is created by these new technologies in the hands of just a few, and that's incredibly dangerous.
Let me endorse that. Our current patent system was state-of-the-art, forward-looking social engineering back in 1787 when we put it in the Constitution as a sign of how progressive we were, but now it's well past our sell-by date. And I think I've just made a decision. Let me announce to everyone taking Econ 2, Principles of Economics, next semester, that if you take my version of the class, you're going to have to learn to do your problem sets in Python.
Oh, awesome, great.
So get ready.
I mean, I should say, Clinton had a science and technology speech, I think it was in 2000, where I was very tickled because he was at Caltech, where I was as a graduate student, talking about some of the topics that I had been working on for my PhD. And at the end of his speech, he said, he doesn't understand what's inside black holes. He doesn't understand why stars blow up. And he doesn't understand why if you add .com to the end of your name, you create $3 billion of market value. I did something similar on a much smaller level in the context of Python and teaching. I've been teaching a class for people to do Python, and this is a programming language for that don't know, in service of science. And I think the title of my class for the last several years has been something like Python for Science. And this year I decided, given the hot topic of data science, to change the name from what it was before to Python for Data Science. And my enrollment went up by an order of magnitude. The power of perception is important. These buzzwords around big data and data science are critical, and I think in some sense as educators we have the chance to seize upon that and teach a different cohort of people that would be learning about, say, computer science than the traditional people. And one of the things I was just completely blown away by is we had a boot camp in advance of this semester-long class in a room that wasn't so much different than this. It was actually in the Brower Center, a block or two away. And we had, I think it was about 250 people come. And what was so remarkable to me, obviously, we asked them to give up 3 days of their lives, so that's a big deal to learn this new language. About 50% of the people in that audience, they were women. And a week later, I went to another sort of boot camp, essentially geared towards computer scientists, and you could count on two hands in a room of 300 all the women in the room. And so there is, there is a cohort of people who can be left behind by the traditional ways that we teach computer science and teach artificial intelligence. If we teach it much more in a practical sense, I think we open up and broaden the diversity of the folks that learn this.
So before, I want to open it up to questions, because I think there are so many different things that are potential areas of questioning. But I want to ask one thing. Brad, if you're requiring Python for your Economics 2 students, and you talk, Josh, about you teach Python and it's important for scientists and all that. Do both of you have the conviction that for the rising generation of students, if they don't code, they're going to be excluded from an productive economic life? Is that going to be essential, or is this just for a technocratic sliver of the economy?
Well, it will certainly give them some extra options that they might not have otherwise. That it's actually unclear to me what people will be programming in come 20 years from now. I try to map what my daughter's learning in her introductory programming classes onto my brain, which I hate to confess is basically still a Fortran brain. That whenever I write something, I would say, how would you do this in Fortran? And then when I show it to the trained professionals, they kind of cry. But, we try. And certainly one thing a university exists to do is to give as many people as possible as many mental tools as possible. And, there are enormous amounts of mental tools, and they're useful in all kinds of places. I know one hedge fund honcho, who says that the best thing for him in his entire education, after he learned enough math to be able to fake it while talking to his quants, was his history class on medieval witchcraft with its focus on source criticism, on why is X writing this in year Y to say Z, what purpose are they trying to serve, and what does that tell us about how we should trust them? And he says for life in Manhattan these days, that's the most important skill you can possibly get.
So my take on that, bringing it back to the technology and the advancements in artificial intelligence, is that as we think about moving from the ability to store data and query it and retrieve it, and just power through questions like what Deep Blue did in beating grandmasters in chess, that was sort of a brute force thing that looked like it was magic, but in the end they were just calculating lots of moves and making the best decision. And then you get to sort of the Watsons of the world that are winning Jeopardy tournaments, really learning to essentially parse language and then really kind of doing queries on existing data stores. As we start moving more and more towards what resembles more like human cognition and understanding and creating hypotheses that then become testable, there is always going to wind up being a role for people in the creative arts. The idea that a computer can be as creative and as insightful as all of us, even for me who's been thinking about this field a lot, feels so far out there. It's certainly not something we're in danger of losing now. So, yes, we need to teach our students how to live in the world that is clearly evolving in front of us and give them those toolkits. But, the notion that we have to, empower everybody to do that, I think is, beyond what I would sign up to.
Great. We have a roving mic here. Why don't we start right here? Bernardo will bring you a mic.
Thank you. My name's Greg. I'm 45, so I'm old enough to be wired, but also can disconnect myself, I think. And something that Brad said, touched on at the very end of his opening comments, grabbed me, that some of the things I'm hearing now, that they're finding that children as old as 10 or in that area, they're seeing that they are less able to interpret facial expressions and communicate in that way because of this world we live in where we're always facing down looking at our smartphone or whatever. And as that relates to not only human contact and emotional well-being, et cetera, there's even things about how when we make eye contact with people or even with our dog, that we're actually generating vitamin B, and there's actually biological aspects to this. So as we move forward with this robotization of our world and interaction and the lack of need to exchange information that's both subconscious and conscious and all that, I wonder what your thoughts are about that, about evolving, and it's a physical phenomena, but it's an emotional phenomena, and it's a cultural phenomena.
So I suppose one way to parse that question, it would be, is the singularity in our future or in our past, and is it scary?
Does everyone know what the singularity is?
I'm driven back to Isaac Asimov's models about his robot detective and his human partner, and trying to deal with societies that had become so wired and so isolated that individual members could barely stand to be in the same room with each other, finding it completely gross and disturbing to actually have another human body within 10 feet of them. Kind of a New Yorker in the 1950s who feels that he's a bit too focused on technology and chemistry and atoms and so forth, trying to write about this as metaphor. And indeed, that's a place where we're heading, and the worry is it's going to make us somewhat less human. On the other hand, I try to think back to what the lives of my ancestors 20,000 years ago were like, let alone the lives of my ancestors 80,000 years ago before the leap that was modern speech as we know it. And I think they probably spent a huge amount of time being hungry and turning all of their processing power to trying to figure out the exact emotional state of everyone else of the 50 people they knew at any point in time. And also trying to watch out for dangers and for possible food sources. That is, when we look at daytime TV and when we look at the magazines in the checkout counter at the supermarket, it's pretty clear that at some fairly deep level, we're wired to focus on three and only three things. And that's possible dangers of violent death, especially as it affects children. Sources of food, or perhaps of other rare, valuable, and impressive resources, and who is sleeping with whom, so you don't get a black eye by making a bad mistake.
Yeah, I would answer I'd answer that very quickly and just say I have to believe that there's sort of a Darwinistic answer to that, in the sense that those that lose the ability or never learn the ability to make that sort of personal contact will be at a disadvantage, always will be at a disadvantage. And there's obviously disadvantages with having disadvantages, right? In terms of finding a mate, in terms of creating wealth for yourself. So yes, it may be a problem, and it may be something that we can try to correct, or we should be trying to correct it. But then I come back to this notion of a digital assistant which understands you much more deeply than Siri, who clearly doesn't understand what I say, and doesn't understand my brain at all, but could be that sort of augmentation device that is making up for the fact that we've lost that sort of human contact or the ability to understand in the way that we have in the past. It's possible that with the next generation of the Google Glass, et cetera, that what we're able to do with others will be even more rewarding and more exciting than what we can do now just by you and I looking at each other.
So why doesn't Siri already know that when I'm dictating, I'm like 10 billion times more likely to say the name of the Swedish economist Knut Wicksell than to say the phrase nut whistle? You think this would be easy?
That's a longer answer, but basically it's because Google has not decided that you're important enough yet to personalize on your words. Yeah.
Okay, we have time. I'm sorry for just one more quick question. Let's go in the middle there.
Brad, you flirted with this question a couple of times during the panel. So if robots are going to take over a bunch of knowledge work, there's a question, how do we figure out how to pay the people who no longer do that work? Would you be willing to hypothesize? Do you have an answer to that question?
Well, as I say, so far we've been very lucky, right? That so far we've been kind of granting people their social worth and also granting people their control over material resources, depending on what they are able to concretely add to our collective store, what they're able to make, and also what they're able to convince us they ought to be able to grab from the common store. Because by now, an overwhelming proportion of all of our wealth is our common joint product rather than our individual product. Put any of us naked out in the Sierra Nevada, even during the rainy season, and the chances of even surviving to make it out of the Sierra Nevada are pretty small. Practically all of what we do is a joint product. And so far, it's worked extremely roughly, but it's been tolerable. That most people get enough to eat, and you kind of scratch your heads on how it is that Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy is able to consume 10,000 pounds a year of stuff, given that he appears to have no social utility at all, except to be occasionally witty, but mostly cross. And yet somehow he's convinced people that this amount of the common store ought to be his. We're moving forward into a world in which we're going to have to figure out a better way to share out of the common store, because we won't be able to rely on people's ability to do something actually concretely, physically useful in order to get control over the material resources and also validation of self-worth to make the system tolerable. My friend and patron Larry Summers touched on this a year and a bit ago when he was here giving the Wildowski lecture, talking about the extraordinarily decline in American male labor force participation, even among peak-aged males. That a surprisingly large chunk of our male population is now in the position where there's nothing that people can think of for them to do that is useful enough to cover the costs of that you need in order to make sure that they actually do it correctly and don't break the stuff when they're supposed to be adding to it. And that's really a problem that human societies have never faced before. But Larry thinks we're starting to see the thin edge of the technological wedge in male forced labor participation trends over the last 30 years. Which I point out is not matched at all by female labor force participation trends. Women were very briefly at a premium on the job market in the last recession, even given the extraordinarily extra share of childcare and household production labor that they do. And it's plain that the next time there's a recession, that will happen again. It will happen somewhat more strongly. It's a worry. It's a scary worry for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Brad and Josh. There's a lot there to think about.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Brad.